He was feared by all, the most ruthless mafia boss. No one dared look him in the eye until a simple woman, a maid, managed to do just that and changed everything. That morning, he noticed something different. The long sleeves, the vacant stare, the way she avoided eye contact. When she dropped the tray and he saw the bruises, something inside him broke. But what he did next, nobody, absolutely nobody, expected it. Vittorio Conti's mansion stood in the heart of Milan, surrounded by ivy-covered walls and wrought-iron gates that seemed to tell anyone approaching, "Don't enter." From afar, it looked like just another historic property belonging to an old money family. But those who crossed that gate felt the weight in the air, the kind of tension that makes your stomach churn. Vittorio was known in the underworld as Il Lupo, the wolf, the man who never forgave, who controlled half the city's illegal businesses and all the loyalties that mattered. A man who dominated everything except the people inside his own home. The mansion had 15 rooms, 7 employees working on a rotating schedule, and one certainty: nobody stayed for very long. Some said the house had bad energy, others that the boss was impossible to please. But the real reason was something nobody dared to verbalize. There was fear within those walls. Not of Vittorio, but of something that happened when he wasn't looking. It was a cold October morning when Marta Rossi first arrived. She was 42 years old, with brown hair pulled back in a low bun and calloused hands from years working in other people's homes. She came from Naples, recommended by an agency that promised discretion and competence. But there was something different about Marta. A quiet determination in her eyes, a posture that suggested she had already seen the worst of humanity and survived. Vittorio barely glanced at her during the brief interview. His attention was focused on the papers on the table, numbers representing debts, territories, betrayals. He wore an impeccable Italian suit, but there was a hardness in his face that no expensive clothing could soften. His fingers drummed on the mahogany table as he spoke on the phone in Sicilian dialect, veiled threats wrapped in politeness. "You start tomorrow," he said when he finally hung up, without looking directly at Marta. "The housekeeper will show you your duties. Don't ask unnecessary questions. Don't get involved in matters that don't concern you. And above all," he raised his eyes for the first time, and they were hard as stone, "don't bother my niece." Marta nodded. But something about that last instruction bothered her. Not the order itself, but the tone. It wasn't protection. It was isolation. It was the kind of command that suggested there was something to hide, something that shouldn't be seen. The next day, Marta started work. The house was immaculate, but it had that strange quality of places that seem like movie sets. Everything in its place, nothing truly lived. The other employees greeted her with nods, but avoided conversation. There was an unspoken rule: look, but don't observe; work, but don't question; survive, but don't live. In the kitchen, the housekeeper, a 60-year-old woman named Signora Benedetti, handed Marta a list of chores and a whispered warning while stirring a pot of sauce. "The girl lives on the 2nd floor, west wing. You clean the hallway, but don't go into her room unless you're called. And never, ever ask about her mother." Marta frowned, watching how the housekeeper's hands trembled as she held the spoon. "Why?" Signora Benedetti didn't answer. She simply pressed her lips into a thin line and left, leaving the smell of stale coffee and unspoken secrets lingering in the kitchen. But Marta saw something in the woman's eyes before she left. Fear, yes, but also something akin to guilt. Vittorio's niece was called Giulia. She was 17 years old, with black hair that fell over her shoulders like heavy curtains, and eyes that seemed too old for her young face. Marta saw her for the first time on the 3rd day, descending the stairs with careful, measured steps, as if each movement hurt, as if the very act of existing were exhausting. She wore a wine-colored, long-sleeved sweater despite the stifling heat inside the house, and kept her arms crossed over her chest protectively, a posture of someone constantly defending herself against unseen attacks. When she passed Marta in the hallway, She didn't look up, keeping her eyes fixed on the polished marble floor. But Marta looked, and she saw. At the base of Julia's neck, just above the collar of her sweater, was a purplish mark. Not small, not accidental. It was a bruise that climbed up her neck like phantom fingers, marks that Marta recognized immediately because she had seen them before in other houses, on the faces of other women who had no voice. It wasn't poorly applied makeup. It wasn't an accidental fall. It was deliberate, repeated and systematic violence. Marta felt her stomach clench, but she said nothing. Not yet. She knew that hasty confrontations saved no one. They only alerted predators to better hide their prey. That night, she lay awake in the small room assigned to her on the ground floor, listening to the sounds of the mansion, or the lack thereof. The silence was heavy, suffocating, the kind that presses on your eardrums and makes your heart pound just to prove you're still alive. It was the silence of a house that held terrible secrets. Around 2 in the morning, he heard quick footsteps in the hallway above. Not the heavy walking of an adult, but the light, hurried sound of bare feet trying not to make a sound. Then a door slammed shut with enough force to echo off the walls, followed by a muffled sound, like someone crying into a pillow, desperately trying not to be heard. Marta stood up, put a robe over her simple pajamas, and climbed the stairs barefoot, each step creaking softly under her weight. The second-floor hallway was dark, lit only by the faint yellowish light coming from under a door at the end, Julia's door. She approached slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs, and pressed her ear against the cold wood. Silence now. But there was something wrong with that silence, something that screamed louder than any sob. It was the silence of someone learning to stifle their own pain. Marta knocked lightly on the door. 3 soft taps. "Julia, is everything all right?" No response. Just the sound of labored breathing from the other end. She waited, counting the seconds, then heard the voice, low, hoarse, broken from crying. "Go away." But Marta didn't go. She had done this before. Walked away, looked away, convinced herself it wasn't her problem, and each time she had done it, she had carried the weight of cowardice for months afterward. "If you need anything, I told you to go away." The cry was filled with despair, not anger. It was the cry of someone who had asked for help so many times without response that now they preferred solitude to disappointment. Marta took a step back, but didn't go down the stairs. She stayed there, leaning against the cold wall of the hallway, slowly sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, her knees bent against her chest. And she waited. She waited until the crying on the other side of the door subsided to irregular sobs, then to deep sighs, then to the heavy silence of complete exhaustion. Only when dawn began to illuminate the high windows of the hallway, painting the marble with pale pink hues, did Marta finally come down. But something had changed in her during those hours of vigil. A decision had been made. A line had been crossed. In the following days, Marta observed with the meticulous attention of a detective, not in an intrusive or obvious way, but with the silent vigilance that comes from years working in homes where secrets were commonplace. Julia rarely left her room. When she did, it was always in clothes that covered as much of her body as possible. Long sleeves even in the heat, long pants, elaborate scarves even when it wasn't cold. She avoided eye contact with everyone, walked close to the walls as if she wanted to disappear into them, ate little during the rare meals she had in the kitchen, and spoke even less. Sometimes entire days would pass without Marta hearing her voice, and the bruises kept appearing like poisonous flowers sprouting on her body. One day on her wrist, visible for only a second when she reached for a glass of water and her sleeve rode up, circular marks that looked like fingers. Another day on her temple, half hidden by her hair but impossible to ignore when the light hit it from a certain angle, a deep purple that spread to her cheekbone. Marta began to mentally document everything. Tuesday, a bruise on her left forearm. Thursday, swelling around her right eye, poorly concealed by heavy makeup. Saturday, a careful gait that suggested bruised ribs. She tried to talk to the other employees, testing the waters carefully. In the laundry room, while folding sheets with one of the younger maids, she casually asked, "The girl seems very isolated. Doesn't she have any friends? Doesn't she go to school?" The maid, a young woman in her early 20s named Chiara, looked around nervously before whispering, "She studies at home. A private tutor comes 3 times a week, but never stays long. He says she's difficult." "Difficult like?" Chiara folded a sheet with quick mechanical movements. "I don't know. I only know that everyone who works directly with her eventually quits. They say she's strange, bad-tempered, but—" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "I think she's scared." "Afraid of what?" Chiara didn't answer. She simply grabbed the basket of clean clothes and left too quickly, her footsteps echoing down the service corridor. Later that afternoon, Marta approached Paolo, the driver, a middle-aged man with a grey moustache and tired eyes, who had seen many things over the years of service to the Conti family. "Paolo," she said as he polished one of the cars in the garage, "does anyone know what happened to the girl's mother?" Paolo stopped polishing, the cloth lying motionless in his hand. For a long moment he didn't answer, only stared at the distorted reflection of himself in the shiny hood of the car. Then, without looking at Marta, he said in a low, careful voice, "He died 3 years ago." "As?" Paolo hesitated, choosing each word as if he were walking through a minefield. "He fell down the stairs. Broken neck. The housekeeper called an ambulance, but it was too late." He paused meaningfully, the kind of pause that says more than words could. "Signor Conti was traveling when it happened. Business in Rome, or perhaps Palermo. He returned for the funeral." Something about the way he said it, as if he were reciting a story that had been rehearsed, polished, repeated so many times that it had lost any connection to the truth, sent alarm bells in Marta's head. "And the girl? Was she here when it happened?" Paolo finally looked at her, and there was something in his eyes, warning, fear, perhaps a silent plea for her to stop asking questions. "Listen, Signora Rossi, you seem like a good woman. Work, get paid, go home. Don't ask questions that could have dangerous answers." He resumed polishing the car, more vigorously now, and Marta understood that this was a conversation no one was willing to have, at least not yet, not while everyone still needed their jobs, their lives. So she decided to go straight to the source. On a sweltering afternoon, while Vittorio was away meeting with his associates in some warehouse by the port, discussing shipments, territories, and the 1,000 petty acts of violence that kept his empire running, Marta went up to Giulia's room. This time, he didn't knock. He merely tested the doorknob, unlocked because who needs locks when fear is prison enough, and gently pushed the door open. The room was large but Spartan, lacking the typical band posters or photographs of friends you'd expect to see in a teenage girl's room. The walls were white and bare. The bed was made with military precision, and there was a museum-like quality to the atmosphere, as if it were a preserved but unlived space. Giulia was sitting on the bed, her back to the door, her shoulders hunched in a posture of permanent defeat. She was wearing a grey, long-sleeved shirt and holding something in her hands. Marta couldn't see what. When she heard the door open, Giulia turned abruptly, and Marta saw her face completely for the first time, without angles or shadows to hide the truth. The left eye was swollen, with a dark purple discoloration spreading from the eyelid to the cheekbone in a painful gradient of purple, blue, and greenish yellow. The lips were cracked, with a small cut at the lower corner that had begun to heal but was still red and inflamed, and there were marks, thin, parallel, red, on her forearm that she instinctively tried to cover, pulling her sleeve down in an automatic movement that spoke of months, perhaps years, of practice. But the worst part wasn't the physical marks. It was the expression in her eyes, empty, disconnected, as if the girl who once inhabited that body had fled to some deep, dark place within herself, leaving only a shell that performed basic survival functions. "Get out of here," Giulia said, but her voice lacked strength. It was merely a conditioned reflex, words spoken because she was expected to say them, not because she truly cared whether Marta stayed or went. Marta closed the door behind her with a soft click and approached slowly, moving as if she were handling a wounded animal that could flee or attack at any moment. She sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "Who is doing this to you?" Marta asked, her voice soft but firm. Julia shook her head violently, her eyes wide with sudden fear, the first sign of real emotion since Marta had entered. "You don't understand. You need to leave. If he finds out you're here, that you saw—" "Who will find out?" Marta asked, even though she already knew the answer. She already knew, but she needed to hear it. She needed Julia to say it out loud. Julia didn't need to say the name. The way she stared at the door, the way her hands trembled, the way her whole body shrank as if trying to disappear, all of that said it. "Your uncle," Marta said, not as a question, but as a confirmation. Tears began to stream down Julia's face, silent at first, then accompanied by sobs that she tried to stifle by biting her fist. He's not like people think. In the streets, he's Il Lupo, the man who never falters, the king who controls everything. But here, when there are no witnesses, when the cameras are off," her voice broke completely. "He doesn't hit me because he's angry about business, or because I did something wrong. He hits me because he can, because nobody will stop him, because I have nowhere to go, nobody to tell, no way to escape." She swallowed hard, wiping away tears with the back of her hand, smudging the makeup she tried to use to hide the bruise. "My mother tried to protect me. She was strong, stronger than me. She threatened to go to the police, said she would tell everyone what he really was, that she would destroy his reputation." Julia looked directly at Marta now, and there was something fierce and broken in that look. And then she fell down the stairs. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. "Do you think he—" Marta began. "I know," Julia interrupted, her voice now firmer, laden with the terrible certainty of someone who witnessed something that cannot be erased. "I was here. I heard them arguing in his office, their voices getting louder and louder. I heard him say that she would regret it, that no one threatens Vittorio Conti and lives to tell the tale." She paused, closing her eyes as if she could block out the memory. But Marta knew it never works that way. The worst moments always become clearer when you close your eyes. "And then I heard the sound of her falling. That sound. You never forget it. The impact, the silence that followed. I ran into the hallway and she was there on the floor, her neck at an angle that necks shouldn't be at." "And was he there?" Marta asked. "At the top of the stairs, looking down. He saw me, and do you know what he said?" Julia gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "He said, 'Accidents happen. Remember that.' And then he picked up the phone and called an ambulance, and instantly transformed into the devastated uncle, the man broken with grief. When the paramedics arrived, he was crying, really crying. He's so good at it that even I almost believed him." Marta sat there, letting the weight of that revelation settle into her bones. She knew men like Vittorio, men who could compartmentalize, who could commit atrocities and then sit down to dinner as if nothing had happened. But knowing theoretically and confronting reality were very different things. "Have you ever tried to run away?" Marta finally asked. "Where to?" Julia asked, with that bitter laugh again. "I have no money of my own, no documents. He keeps my passport, my ID, everything locked in his safe. And even if I managed to leave this house, he would find me. He has people all over Milan, all over Italy. There's nowhere I can hide from him." She looked at her own hands, turning them over as if they were strange objects. "I used to have friends. I went to school. I had a life. But after my mother died, he took everything away from me. He said it was for my safety, that his enemies could use me against him. But I know the truth. It's because he doesn't want anyone to see me like this. He doesn't want to risk me telling anyone." She finally looked at Marta, and there was an unspoken question in those eyes, a last spark of hope that she was desperately trying not to nurture for fear of having to watch it fade away. "Why are you here? Why do you care? All the other maids saw and pretended not to. It's easier that way. Safer. Marta took a deep breath before answering. Because when I was 23, I worked for a family in Naples. They had a daughter, 18 years old, beautiful and bright, and her father beat her. I saw the signs, the same ones I'm seeing in you, and I did nothing. I convinced myself that it wasn't my place, that I needed the job, that she surely had other adults in her life who could help. Marta's voice trembled slightly. 3 months after I left that job, I read in the newspaper that she had jumped off a bridge. She was 19 years old, and since then every time I close my eyes, I see her face and wonder, what if I had done something? What if someone had cared enough to act? Tears were streaming down Marta's face now too. So to answer your question, I care because I can't live with another face haunting me. I care because you deserve better than this. And I care because this time I can make a difference. Julia studied Marta's face for a long moment, searching for signs of deceit or a hidden agenda. But all she saw was raw and painful sincerity. Then, we're going to make him stop, Marta said with a determination that surprised even herself. Julia looked at her as if she had completely lost her mind. You can't just make him stop. You don't understand who he is, what he's capable of. I understand perfectly, Marta interrupted. But I also understand something you may have forgotten. Men like your uncle have power because people are afraid to challenge them. But power based on fear is fragile. And when you find the right crack and press on, everything crumbles. She leaned forward, holding Julia's gaze. But you need to trust me, completely. And you need to be willing to be brave for just a little longer. Can you do that? Julia hesitated, a lifetime of fear and trauma pulling her back to the terrifying safety of the known. But then she thought of her mother, of all the maids who had passed through there and done nothing, of all the days stretching out before her in a grey eternity of pain. And she nodded. Yes, she whispered, I trust you. That night Marta didn't sleep. She sat in the small room planning. Vittorio Conti was powerful, yes, but power wasn't the same as invincibility. Every man had weaknesses, and the trick was to find the right one and squeeze until he broke. In the following days, Marta began to do something that no one else in that house had done. She paid attention. She observed Vittorio's schedule, his meetings, the people who came and went. She listened to conversations through closed doors, memorized names, faces, patterns, and she waited. The opportunity came 2 weeks later. Vittorio was in his office, on the phone, speaking in a low but tense voice to someone about a shipment that had been intercepted by the police. Marta was cleaning the nearby hallway, but she could hear every word. When he hung up, she knocked on the door. "Come in," he said, annoyed. Marta entered, holding a tray of coffee, a pretext she had prepared. "I thought you might want something hot," she said, placing the tray on the table. Vittorio barely glanced at her. "Leave it there." But Marta didn't leave. She stood there, her eyes fixed on him, until he finally looked up. "Is there something else?" "Yes," Marta said, her voice firm in a way that surprised even herself. "I know what you're doing to Julia." The air in the room changed instantly. Vittorio's eyes narrowed, and he stood slowly, the chair creaking under his weight. "Be careful what you say, Signora Rossi." "I don't need to be careful," Marta replied, "because I'm not the only one who knows. There are photographs of the marks, the bruises, and there's a letter detailing everything that will be given to the police if anything happens to me, or to her." It was a lie. There were no photographs, no letter. But Vittorio didn't know that, and for the first time since Marta had arrived at that house, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't control. It was fear. "You're bluffing," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Do you want to take the risk?" Marta asked. "Do you want to see your reputation destroyed? Do you want to see all your businesses, all your alliances crumble because you couldn't control your own monster?" Vittorio took a step forward, and for a moment Marta thought he was going to attack her. Her muscles tensed, ready to run, scream, fight, anything. But then he stopped, because he realized something Marta already knew. Violence leaves marks. and marks were evidence. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I want you to stop," Marta said. "I want you to never lay a finger on her again. And I want you to release her, give her the documents, give her enough money to start a life far away from here. Do that, and you'll never see me or hear from me again." Vittorio studied her face for a long moment. "What if I refuse? So, tomorrow morning, the police will receive a very interesting package, along with copies sent to their rivals, their business partners, and the press. Imagine the headlines. Mafia boss beats teenage niece. Imagine how that will affect their business." Marta leaned forward slightly. "You can kill me, but you can't kill the story." Vittorio didn't answer immediately. He returned to his chair, sat down, his fingers drumming on the wooden table. Finally, he said, "You have 24 hours to get out of my house. Take the girl with you. But if I ever find out you've spoken about this to anyone—" "You're not going to find out," Marta interrupted, "because you'll be too busy trying to fix your own life." She turned and left, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. That night, Marta went to Giulia's room. The girl was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. "Pack your things," Marta said. "We're leaving tomorrow." Giulia sat up, her eyes wide. "What? How?" "Don't ask. Just trust me." And for the first time in years, Giulia did exactly that. The following morning, when the sun had barely risen, Marta and Giulia left through the front door of the Conti mansion. Paolo, the driver, was waiting outside with a car. Marta had asked him to do this favor, and he, perhaps out of guilt or perhaps out of decency, had agreed. "Where to?" he asked. "The train station," Marta said. "And after that I don't know, but far from here." As the car rolled down the hill, Giulia glanced back one last time, watching the mansion disappear among the trees. "Do you think he'll keep his word?" Giulia asked. "I don't know," Marta admitted. "But I know he's scared right now, and scared men make mistakes. And when he does, we'll be ready." They traveled south to a small coastal town where Marta had a sister she hadn't seen in years. The sister, Rosa, didn't ask any questions when she saw Giulia's condition. She simply opened the door and said, "Stay as long as you need." In the following weeks, Giulia began to heal, not just physically but in deeper ways. The bruises disappeared. The fear in her eyes began to lessen. She started talking more, smiling sometimes, looking like who she was, a 17-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her. And Marta kept her promise. She didn't tell Giulia's story to anyone, but she did something more. She began searching for other stories, other women, other girls who had passed through the Conti mansion over the years and disappeared or left quietly, and she discovered they weren't alone. There was a housekeeper who had left 3 years earlier with a broken arm, a cook who had been fired after accidentally seeing something she shouldn't have, a maid who worked before Giulia's mother, whose fate was unknown. She simply disappeared. Marta gathered these stories, these voices, these fragments of truth, and then, 6 months after leaving Milan, she did something no one expected. She went to the police, not to the local police, corrupt and bought by men like Vittorio, but to a federal investigator who had built a reputation for going after untouchables. The investigator, a woman named Capitana Elena Marchetti, heard everything. And then she said, "Are you willing to testify?" Marta thought of Giulia, of Isabella of Naples, whose story she had carried for so long, of all the women who had been silenced. "Yes," she said, "I am." The process took months. There were threats, attempts at intimidation, offers of money that Marta refused. Vittorio hired the best lawyers, used all his connections, but this time there was too much evidence, too many witnesses, too many truths. And when Giulia, now 18, took the witness stand and told her story in a firm, clear voice, something changed. The jury saw not the myth of Il Lupo, but a man who had used his power to destroy the most vulnerable people in his life. The sentence was read on a rainy April afternoon. 15 years for abuse, plus charges related to his criminal activities that came to light during the investigation. Vittorio Conti was led away in handcuffs, and for the first time he seemed small. Outside the courthouse, Giulia held Marta's hand. "What are we going to do now?" she asked. Marta looked at the girl who had become a young woman, strong and courageous, in ways she herself was still discovering. "To live," Marta said simply. "Let's live." And they did exactly that. Julia enrolled in university, studying law with the determination to help others who were trapped as she had been. Marta continued her work, not as a domestic worker, but as an advocate, helping women escape abusive situations, giving them the tools and courage to rebuild their lives. Years later, when Julia graduated at the top of her class, she invited Marta to the ceremony. As she walked up the stage to receive her diploma, she looked for Marta in the audience and waved. And Marta waved back, her eyes filled with proud tears, knowing that this girl, this woman, had not only survived, but thrived. That evening, sitting in a small restaurant celebrating, Julia raised her glass. "A toast," she said, "to the woman who saw my scars and didn't look the other way." Marta clinked her glass against Julia's, "To the girl who trusted a stranger and found her own strength." They drank, and in that moment they both understood something fundamental. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about freeing the survivors. It's about transforming pain into purpose, silence into voice, fear into courage. And as the city stretched out around them, with all its shadows and lights, they knew they had won not just a battle, but reclaimed their own lives. The fear that had ruled the Conti mansion for so long had finally been broken, not by force, not by violence, but by a woman who refused to accept that some people were untouchable, and a girl who refused to remain invisible. And in that simple yet profound act of seeing and being seen, they had changed everything. 10 years had passed since that rainy morning when Vittorio Conti was led away in handcuffs from the courthouse. 10 years in which the world continued to turn, indifferent to the individual dramas unfolding in its forgotten corners. But for Marta and Julia, those 10 years were not just time passing. They were an entire life rebuilt, brick by brick, choice by choice. Julia was now 28 and one of Italy's most respected victims' rights lawyers. Her office was in a modest building in the center of Milan. Ironic, she sometimes thought, that she had returned to the same city where she had almost died. But Milan was no longer Vittorio's city. It was her city, reclaimed meter by meter. On a cold November morning, Julia was in her office reviewing a case when her phone rang. It was an unknown number, but she answered anyway. You never knew when someone might need help. "Hello? Dr. Conti?" The voice was young, trembling, heavy with barely contained fear. "My name is Sophia. A friend gave me your number. She said that you could help." Julia straightened up in her chair, recognizing the tone. It was the same tone her own voice had years ago, when she still believed there was no way out. "I'm listening, Sophia. Are you safe now? I'm in a cafe. He doesn't know where I am. Yet." A pause, a deep breath. "I need to leave. I need to get out of here before it's too late." "You're going out," Julia said with the certainty of someone who had made that promise hundreds of times and kept it. "Give me the address. I'll send someone to pick you up in 15 minutes. And Sophia?" She waited. "You've already done the hardest part. You asked for help. The rest we'll do together." After hanging up, Julia called Marta. Even after all these years, she was still the first person Julia called when someone needed rescuing. Marta had become the heart of the support network they had built. She wasn't the one who dealt with the legal or bureaucratic aspects, but she was the one who knew exactly what to say to make a terrified woman believe there was hope. "Marta, we have a new one. Sophia, 22 years old. She's ready to leave. I'll send Paolo to pick her up." Marta replied immediately. Paolo, the same driver who had taken them away from the Conti mansion a decade ago. After Vittorio was arrested, Paolo had left the family's service and joined Marta's network, using his driving skills to do what he called freedom routes, picking up women and taking them to safe houses. "How are you?" Julia asked. It was a question they always asked each other, an emotional check-in that had become a ritual. "Tired," Marta admitted. "But okay, and you?" "Same here. See you at dinner on Friday? I wouldn't miss it for anything. That Friday, as they had done on the first Saturday of each month for years, Marta, Julia, and several other women from the network gathered at the apartment that Marta and her sister Rosa shared on the outskirts of Milan. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was always full of life, voices overlapping, laughter, the smell of home-cooked food, children running between the adults' legs. Among those present was Francesca, Vittorio's former accountant, who now worked for a financial transparency NGO, tracking money from criminal organizations. There was Chiara, the young maid who had worked at the mansion, and who now coordinated temporary shelters. And there was Sophia, the newcomer, whom Marta and Julia had rescued a few days earlier, still with that frightened, deer-like look, but beginning to relax as she saw she was among people who understood. "I have news," Francesca announced as everyone sat with plates of food on their laps. "Do you remember that scheme we were tracking in Naples? We managed to freeze the accounts, 23 million euros that will now be reallocated to funds supporting victims." Applause and cheers erupted in the room. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but every small victory added up. Every frozen account meant less power for men like Vittorio, more resources for women like Sophia. "Speaking of Naples," Marta said, her voice growing quieter, "I received a letter this week from a woman named Isabella Costa." Julia looked at her surprised. She recognized that name. It was the surname of the girl Marta hadn't been able to save, the one who had jumped off the bridge. "Isabella?" "The younger sister," Marta explained, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She's 23 now, the same age I was when I worked for her family. She said she read about our work in a newspaper article and wanted to write to me." Marta pulled the letter from her pocket, its edges worn from being folded and unfolded so many times. She said, "My sister wasn't lucky enough to find someone like you. But because of what you're doing now, I know other sisters won't suffer the same fate. Thank you for transforming your pain into purpose. Maria would be proud." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when words are so heavy with meaning that they need space to be absorbed. "Maria," Julia said softly. "Was that her name?" Marta nodded. "Maria Isabella Costa, 19 years old. Blonde hair. She dreamed of being a teacher." She wiped her eyes. "For a long time, all I could remember about her was her face in the newspaper obituary. But now, when I close my eyes, I see all the Marias we managed to save. I see you, Julia. I see Francesca, Chiara, Sophia. I see all the women who are alive and free because once, a long time ago, I decided I would never look away again." Sophia, who had been quiet for most of the night, finally spoke. "You talk about saving people. But what happens afterward? After you leave, after the danger has passed? How do you live with the memories? How do you wake up in the morning and not feel afraid?" It was Julia who answered, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had made that journey. "You don't stop feeling afraid immediately. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and still hear your footsteps in the hallway. I still close my eyes and see that hallway, those stairs where my mother died." And she paused, looking around the room filled with women who had become her chosen family. "But with time, you learn that fear doesn't define you. It's just a part of you, like a scar. And scars are proof that you survived, not that you're broken. And you're never alone," Marta added. "That's the most important part. You don't have to heal alone. You don't have to be strong alone. We're here, always." Sophia wiped her eyes, a small smile appearing for the first time since she had arrived. "Can I come back? To the next meeting?" "You can come back whenever you want," Julia said. "This is your home now, too." Later that night, after the others had left, and it was just Marta and Julia washing dishes in the kitchen, a ritual of theirs, those quiet moments after the chaos, Julia said, "You know he asked to see me?" Marta didn't need to ask who. "Vittorio?" "Yes, I get a letter from him every 6 months. Always the same thing, saying he's sorry, that he wants to talk, that he deserves forgiveness." Julia methodically wiped a plate. "I never reply." "You don't have to answer," Marta said. "You don't owe him anything, not forgiveness, not closure, nothing." "I know." But sometimes I wonder, does he really regret it? Or is it just another manipulation, another control game? Marta thought for a moment before answering. Honestly, it doesn't matter. Whether his remorse is genuine or not doesn't change anything he did. It doesn't undo the pain he caused. The only thing that matters is that you are free from him, that you have built a beautiful, meaningful, powerful life, that you have transformed your survival into purpose. Julia stopped washing the dishes, looking out the kitchen window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. You know what's funny? Sometimes I forget I was a victim. Not in the sense of denying what happened, but I don't see myself that way anymore. I'm not Julia, the girl who was abused by her uncle. I'm just Julia, lawyer, friend, survivor, fighter. That's the goal, Marta said softly. Not to let the worst moment of your life define all the moments that come after. They finished washing the dishes in comfortable silence, then sat on the small balcony of the apartment with cups of tea, watching the city fall asleep. From that vantage point, Milan seemed almost peaceful, lights twinkling like fallen stars, the distant murmur of traffic like a steady river. Do you think we made a difference? Julia asked suddenly. A real, measurable difference? Marta looked at her, surprised by the question. Are you kidding? Julia, in the last 10 years, our network has helped more than 200 women escape abusive situations. 200. Each one of them is a life saved. A story that didn't end in tragedy. I know, Julia said quickly, but there are thousands we haven't reached, millions globally. Sometimes it feels like a drop in the ocean. Perhaps, Marta agreed. But do you know what happens to drops in the ocean? They come together, they form waves, and waves change coastlines. She took a sip of her tea. Besides, for each of those 200 women, it wasn't a drop in the ocean. It was everything. It was the difference between life and death, between prison and freedom. Julia smiled, that genuine smile that was still rare, but becoming more and more frequent. When did you become so wise? I've always been wise, Marta joked. You're just finally paying attention. They laughed, and in that laughter there was lightness. Not the forgetting of the trauma, but proof that joy and pain could coexist, that it was possible to bear scars and still dance. Marta, Julia said after a moment, thank you, not only for saving me, but for continuing to save me. Every day, in every little way. You do the same for me, Marta replied. We save each other. That's the secret people like Vittorio never understand, that true strength doesn't come from dominating others, but from lifting each other up. They sat there late into the night, two women whose destinies had improbably intertwined, united not by blood, but by something stronger. Choice, courage, love born from witnessing each other's worst and choosing to stay nonetheless. And when they finally went to sleep, while Milan breathed softly under the starry sky, they both knew something profound and true. Vittorio Conti's mansion had long since been sold, the walls torn down, the secrets exposed to the light. But what Marta and Julia had built there, this network of outstretched hands, this stream of voices that refused to be silenced, this chosen family of survivors who became warriors, that was permanent. And every time Sophia or any other woman picked up the phone and dialed that number, every time someone chose to trust, chose to ask for help, chose to believe that there was life on the other side of fear, the victory multiplied. The wolf had fallen, but the women he had tried to destroy, they were standing stronger than ever, building a world where other wolves would have fewer and fewer places to hide. And that, Marta thought as she closed her eyes to sleep, was justice in its truest form, not just punishment, but transformation, not just survival, but flourishing. The story that had begun with bruises and fear ended with purpose and hope, and perhaps that was the greatest victory of all.